So this is a Gen Z panel. I have a kid. This is the confession. I have a kid who is the same age as two of these panelists. So there we go.
I'm the boomer on stage.
What?
I'm the boomer on stage.
Yes, you're the boomer, and we will make lots of jokes about that. The clock is not on, everyone. So our clock is not going, which means we will just stay here forever. Okay, thank you. So what we're going to do first is everybody is going to say 2 lines about themselves so that you guys can just know, not, just so we can get it going. So we're going to start with Theo. Go. Sum up your whole life in 2 lines. Go.
I will do my best. There hasn't been that much of it.
Oh, yes. So mean, so mean. Go. You're getting all the hard questions.
Hi, everyone. My name is Theo Baker. Super happy to be here. I am an investigative journalist. When I was 17 years old, I started working on a project researching research misconduct and Alzheimer's fraud that ultimately resulted in the resignation of Stanford's billionaire road science neuroscientist president.
Yes, he took down a president at 17. Emma.
Hi, my name is Emma Blankstein. I am an organizer in the student climate movement and with the Sunrise Movement and Campus Climate Network, and I do a lot of work particularly related to getting the influence of big oil out of universities across the United States.
And quite annoyingly, they are both juniors at Ivy League institutions. Continue.
Hey, we're not Ivy League, thank you. We're not the snooty East Coasters.
And at Stanford, perhaps you've heard of it. Go on. Yeah.
My name is David Hogg. I'm a gun safety advocate, a newly elected vice chair of the DNC, and just happy to be here.
Yes, all right. So we are going to talk about this generation and how they're going to save us all, no pressure. I want to start with, we were talking behind the scenes actually about the difference between post-COVID and pre-COVID Gen X. And David had a pretty interesting take on it. So I want you guys, I'm going to start with David, and we're going to talk about what the sort of difference is, how COVID changed Gen X. You go first.
Well, I don't know how it changed Gen X. Maybe some of you guys do.
Oh, Gen Y.
But Gen Z.
Gen Z, whatever. Whatever generation it is that you guys
I mean,
are.
we've gone full circle at this point. Apparently, there's Gen Alpha and Gen Beta now, and I'm like, damn, I'm getting old.
Yeah, you are.
But with Gen Z, for a long time, politically, we were defined as living under Donald Trump, right? Like, the first wave of Gen Z, I would say, is defined by, and by the way that you can typically define or tell whether or not somebody is in Gen Z is you ask them if they remember 9/11 or not. Right. If they don't remember 9/11, they're probably Gen Z or obviously Gen Alpha or something younger than that. If they do remember 9/11, they're probably a millennial or older than that. And for the first wave of Gen Z, my segment of Gen Z, that was, late 1990s, early 2000s when we were born. We grew up with our political awakening being defined under 8 years of President Obama's presidency, right? Those norms of having the first black president, of that social progress, everything like that. And then when we were in high school, for many of us, we saw the election of Donald Trump in 2016, and it was extremely jarring. And we reacted by creating some of the largest student protests in American history. Whether it was, or not even student protests, just seeing some of the largest protests in American history. For every year of Donald Trump's presidency, he put our country into such anaphylaxis about what was happening that there was a new chapter of a social movement that was born every year of that presidency. Whether that was the Women's March at the beginning, the March for Our Lives for gun safety in 2018, the environmental movement and Sunrise in 2019, or the movement for racial justice in 2020. And that is part of what really defined our political awakening at the beginning of Gen Z. But what we saw is during COVID, and what we saw in this past election, was something very interesting, which is that the younger people that were in high school during COVID went substantially more to the right than the young people that were in college, for example, or had already graduated high school before COVID. So you have pre-COVID Gen Z and post-COVID Gen Z, and those two are not the same. Yeah. We can't treat this generation like a monolith. The post-COVID Gen Z has grown up with Donald Trump being the status quo, being the normal, with the politics of outrage being normal, right? And for them, I think what we're seeing is a counterculture against the counterculture that were those protests, of being politically incorrect, of being, audacious and outrageous in different ways, and that becoming more and more accepted within that generation. What we saw not only was an 8-point drop off in overall 18 to 29-year-old voter turnout compared to 2020, we also saw a 20-point shift to the right of 18 to 29-year-olds this cycle.
More for men, right?
Wait, go on. Go.
Well, but it was very much driven by men, this counterculture, this revolution that you're talking about. A lot of it, I think, is being driven by resistance to the Me Too movement, by resistance to, whatever woke is defined as by the people who use it as some sort of caricature. And it's a fascinating part of it because, right, our generation is, as much as it might be politically engaged, is not super politically conscious. If you look at the numbers, I think Princeton did a study last year, or maybe it was 2 years ago, but it was definitely in between midterms and the 2024 elections, which was a 4,000-person study, nationally representative sample of 18 to 24-year-olds. And in a multiple choice questionnaire, not even 1/3 of 18 to 24-year-olds could correctly say which were the two parties in charge of Congress.
Oops.
Right? And that's our baseline. That's where we're starting from.
That feels bad.
I think you have people right nowadays who feel like they know more than they ever have before. And in some ways it's true. We have more, democratized access to information than ever has been possible in the past. And yet we also somehow live in even more insular communities. It's just not divided by geographic tract, it's divided by ideological tract.
Hannah, I'm curious what your take on this is.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the difference between older and younger Gen Z is definitely visible kind of from the perspective of being in Gen Z. And I also think that the trend of young men to the right, I think, was an awakening for a lot of people. I think for many years, there was this impression that Gen Z was this politically aware generation that had solid kind of leftist values that was going to kind of save America from Donald Trump. And I think what became increasingly clear is that Gen Z is subject to the same social, political forces than any generation that came before us. In fact, probably more so because of the vulnerability of the internet and having different algorithms that people get and different content that people receive because of their ideology. And so I think kind of thinking about Gen Z as being subject to these forces is really important, to not just kind of paint it as this kind of idealistic generation that has these values, but really has a lot of ideological differences which are kind of underpinned by these differences put forth by the experiences with COVID.
So one of the things I want to ask you guys, because we're talking about this divide in Gen Z, which I find fascinating. I hope you guys find it fascinating. Okay, good, because otherwise we're still going to do it. This is what I'm
Got
interested
36
in.
minutes.
Right. Yeah, you only have 36 minutes left. Maybe we'll go on. One of the things that when you're talking about this that strikes me is how much of this rightward shift is information, how much of it is and again, COVID is COVID, and I don't want to say government overreach because I'm not convinced that it was. I mean, obviously, it's a pandemic and the choices were made under such duress that they were maybe good, maybe bad. They were just what was right in front of legislators and what they felt they had to do. But I'm just curious, and David, I'm going to start with you, to talk about how you think government played a role in that.
Well, honestly, I think what played much more of a role in it is our government's. And I'm going to start out before I say this saying that I don't know exactly what the answer is here because these algorithms are a black box,
right?
Ultimately,
right?
And they're increasingly driving our society apart and dividing it massively. We're seeing when it comes to the young men issue, this is not a U.S.-centric issue. This is not even a issue that is isolated to Anglophone countries or anything like that. It is happening in almost every major industrialized country around the world. Women are going more to the left, and men are going more to the right. This is happening all over. So we can't just look at it like, well, what was it that the U.S. government did? Because this is a broader global thing. And to me, what it's a signal of is I think it's the confounding of multiple variables. I think, one, as countries transition to service-based economies away from heavy industry that are traditionally more masculine, there's increasingly a question of what is the role of a man in society as they step away from those roles, and they often feel more isolated. I think, too, it's also the algorithms that are out there that are taking advantage of our young men, especially since COVID, because I think the shift was already happening, but especially during COVID, when we shut down our schools, we told them they couldn't have their proms, they couldn't have their graduations, and it was understandable why we did that. We wanted to protect people, right? But ultimately, taking that away from our young people is it's gonna hurt them, and it's going to be a permanent memory for them of what government means to
Well,
them.
that was why I asked that question.
And for them, it's a very controlling force, and naturally young people want to rebel against the thing that's trying to control them. For us, I can't say for us, but for my segment of Gen Z, what that was in particular was Donald Trump, and the fact that we saw that after school shootings, he would say, "Oh, we're just going to send you our thoughts and prayers," over and over again, and how much bullshit we thought that was, right? It was our failure to address the climate crisis and so many other things. And I think the government in this case in particular, because of our response to COVID and us shutting down schools, and I'm not, of course, hindsight is 2020. We didn't know the different impacts of COVID on the age cohorts at the time. But naturally, young people, when they're told that they're going to have to be online and lose some of the best years of their life when they're in high school, are going to be hurt by that. And it's going to take time for us to earn their trust back and do a better job of showing them what government actually can mean and how it can work to help them. And in our case in particular, I think specifically for the Democratic Party, what we need to do is show our young people that we are working to rebuild the American dream, because many of them don't feel like it exists for them anymore. They don't feel like they're going to be better off than their parents. They don't feel like they're ever going to have a chance to own a home. They don't feel like even if they do go to college and work their ass off, that they're ever going to be able to get ahead because they're going to be crushed by student debt. And they're also worried about the climate crisis and also obviously school shootings going on all the time. And we don't have the luxury of being single issue voters, because there's so many different confounding problems that we're facing all the time. And what I think it's important that the Democratic Party does for our young people is give them a reason to vote for us that isn't just we aren't Republicans, we aren't as bad as them, but we're Democrats and we deliver and we actually care about you and we're here to be honest with you. And in the future, when prices are high, we're going to acknowledge that prices are high and tell you what we're doing about it. We're not going to just throw a graph of the G7 or the unemployment rate or the GDP or the S&P in your face and say you shouldn't feel that way. When the president is old, we're not going to say, in my opinion, we shouldn't say, no, he's not, don't worry about it, he's as strong as a bull. Right? If you tell voters not to believe their wallets and not to believe your eyes, no matter their age, you're going to lose them.
So, I mean, the one thing I would say is that this group doesn't really vote anyway, so, I mean, it would be nice.
Hey. We're voting at a rate higher than any of the generations in this room did when we were your age. I'm just saying.
No, listen, I love you guys, and I think you guys are very adorable, and I don't want to be patronizing here, but anyway, I want you guys, the thing I'm the most interested in as we're talking about this is the gender divide, because that is a real phenomenon. And one of the things we saw in the Harris election was that there was a real play to non-college educated white women, which is a pretty big group. They identified more with their whiteness than their gender. They made a deal with the devil. We'll see how it turns out. It's very typical. It has been historically true. But we are seeing women really go to the left and men go to the right. So Hannah, talk about why you think that is, and Emma, talk about why you think that is and sort of what you see in your own life.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the overturning of Roe v. Wade was a really big mobilization point for young women, and I think throughout Donald Trump's initial presidency and then in the time intervening and then now, I think his vagrant disrespect for women is incredibly obvious to young women, and I think there is a desire for that. However, as Molly noted, there is this phenomenon of kind of swing white women voters going to Donald Trump, and I think that it's really interesting to kind of see this, and particularly even online, the phenomena of trad wives, so-called traditional wives who are women who choose to kind of uphold so-called traditional values of not working and deferring to their husband for everything and not having financial independence. And while it is important for women to obviously have choice and autonomy about what to do with their lives, there are a lot of women online kind of preaching this as an ideal while they're kind of making large sums of money from these social media accounts and then telling other women not to have their own streams of income. But I think seeing this, Gen Z, kind of similarly to the phenomenon David was describing of younger Gen Z not really remembering a time before Donald Trump's presidency, I think with a lot of Gen Z people not remembering what it was like, what life was like before the feminist movement in the times of our grandparents and our great-grandparents, when women couldn't have their own credit cards, when women couldn't voluntarily get divorced, and
Couldn't
I think
wear pants.
couldn't wear pants. There were so many things, and I think kind of the freedoms that the feminist movement won, that women got really used to and comfortable with, I think there's not a realization of what life looks like when these rights are taken away. And so I think collective memory can be very short in this country, unfortunately, and I think that we're seeing that with a lot of Gen Z women who have gone to the right and who might not necessarily be thinking about what life looks like when rights are taken away.
Theo Baker.
Yeah, well, it's kind of interesting. It's funny. You have these like 25-year-olds on TikTok cosplaying Phyllis Schlafly, right?
Right.
Yeah.
It's
And
amazing.
Yeah.
and they're doing
End
this.
times, baby. End times. Go on.
So look, my perspective, right, is biased because of the work that I do, right? And so that means that I probably focus more on the media element of it. I do think the information and the fragmentation of our information economy has been really key in sort of not just shaping, but also dividing different groups. If you look, right, we're talking about how women voted during the election. Well, actually, Kamala Harris's two greatest voting demographics, over 90% of black women and over 90% of Jewish women voted
very,
for
very
Donald-
proud,
yeah,
baby.
very good.
Very proud. I have to say, we understood the assignment. Continue. Yes.
And by the way, this is after all of the post-October 7th, like this is going to divide our party. I mean, that was maybe a little bit overblown. But for me, one of my first gigs actually was studying disinformation. I worked with a nonpartisan research group, the Stanford Stanford Internet Observatory and the Election Integrity Partnership as a part of it. And so I was in the war room day after day, just looking at this content, trying to flag and identify disinformation in real time. And that was an incredible crash course for me because I got to witness firsthand how these jokes and rumors and offhand comments can so quickly spiral and become almost sort of dogmatically, observed by people within a certain group. For people who don't necessarily understand how these algorithms work, maybe I'll try to take a stab at understanding
please.
how the
Please.
guy who looks like me gets radicalized
Yes.
to the right. Maybe it starts because you're watching a soccer video, right, on YouTube, and the guy is buff and he's 6'5", and maybe, by the way, there's a football YouTuber named Theo Baker, so maybe you're watching Theo Baker.
Yeah.
It's not this one. And maybe the guy makes, a crack about women, right, and you laugh and it's funny. And then the next video, you get more of it. And then suddenly you go from watching something that is stereotyped and predominantly male to full-on Andrew Tate watching a sex trafficker, as an 8-year-old,
Yeah.
right? And the descent, the spiral into, little rabbit holes is so rapid and so difficult to escape that once your algorithm is set, you're effectively never going to get out of it.
Right.
And we live in an economy, an information economy right now, where our consumption, I would say, is more passive than it ever has been.
Yeah.
We are fed content either because our friends are sharing it to us or because algorithms that pretend to be our friends are sharing it. And we think that we are more global than ever before because I am having conversations with someone in rural Oklahoma at the same time as I am and someone in Cincinnati.
Yeah.
But we're just sorting ourselves in different ways, and we're actually creating more extreme echo chambers than we've ever seen. Because the things that get rewarded, the things that get clicks are the ones that are ever the more inflammatory. And they usually start, right, with a hint of truth. If you remember, I don't know if you guys followed the story about this hashtag Save the Children hashtag on Facebook a couple years back. It got flooded with tens of millions of posts by QAnon supporters because people took the idea of human trafficking, of child trafficking, right, which is a real problem, a real issue. There are, at any given time in the entire world, there are more than 40 million people who are being trafficked. Trafficking is a real issue. But they took this, and they took something with a grain of truth, and they made it into something that was entirely different. They made it into Comet Pizza, which was my local pizza shop, that somehow Hillary Clinton is running a pedophile sex ring there, and a guy comes in with an AR-15. Right. And to see how quickly we are able to find ourselves in alternate realities on the left and the right is something that is both A, deeply disturbing, and B, is only going to get so much worse as the information age continues to fracture.
I have one question, which is, and I think that's totally correct, and everyone on this stage agrees with you. Anyone who has been on YouTube knows YouTube has an algorithm. TikTok has a very, very, very sticky algorithm that the Chinese government will not allow us to learn. So they refuse to sell. I mean, part of why the Chinese government, the Chinese Communist Party, refuses to sell TikTok to an American entity is because they don't want Americans to get the algorithm, which in itself should be pretty terrifying as to why. But I think this is really important. So who do you guys, I'm curious, in my mind, I see this as a government failure, right? A failure of regulation, right? Make it open source, make it so that everyone knows where the information is coming from. But how do you see, this has become sort of one of the predominant facts of life for anyone who is, in your age group. Who failed you here, and how did it happen? Start with David.
I think it comes down to the fact that these tech companies know that the single biggest threat to them is the US government. It is the only thing that can break them up. They've become incredibly powerful. We are living through the largest time, in my opinion, in human history of the democratization of information since the invention of the printing press, which I don't know if you remember back then, but maybe some of you do. But it did lead to a bit of a schism in the Catholic Church and several hundred years of religious warfare that followed that. And across Europe, from my understanding of the time period, second only to the Bible, the most printed book of that time period was a book on how to hunt witches. Right. Because ultimately, when we have this master democratization of media, like we're seeing right now, the truth, it ceases to exist for most people because it becomes not what actually is factually the truth, it becomes what feels like it could be the truth. We saw this during the campaign, right? When J.D. Vance went out there and said, when he was confronted about his horrifyingly racist comments about how Haitian immigrants were eating dogs and cats. And he said, well, I know that's not true, but it feels like it could be.
Right.
That's not leadership.
Right.
Right? That's bullshit.
Right.
I think what is happening right now is that these tech companies know that they could be broken up if we had a stronger Democratic Party. So what they've started doing is helping to gear already algorithms that were, in my opinion, were already biased to the right and getting them to become even more like this whole masculinization of Mark Zuckerberg.
Right.
This is so that it's not because he actually feels like that, right? It's because he knows that in order for him to avoid Meta getting broken up, which it needs to be, in order for him to prevent that, he needs to frame it as a political prosecution.
Yep.
And that is why he is trying to grow this right-wing base right now, so he can say, no, the reason I'm trying to get broken up is because they're coming after me and I'm a right-winger now, and I'm masculine, and I'm a man, and they're trying to stop that. Because our tech companies, over the next decade, I guarantee you, are going to become seen as the 21st century equivalent, specifically our social media companies, are going to become the mental health equivalent of big tobacco. Because they are simultaneously selling us the problem and the purported solution at the same time to our young people. They're helping to exacerbate the loneliness epidemic so they can turn you into the product, to sell you and keep you engaged and isolated so you stay on there more, so that you end up going down that right-wing hellhole, right? Where all of a sudden you get broken up with your girlfriend and you start going to the gym. So you're looking at, a video of how do you do your bicep curls. And then all of a sudden you get recommended an Andrew Tate video next to that because you're told the pain that you feel isn't because of the fact that you need to grow as a human being, it's because she is the problem, right? Or that minority is the problem. And it gives you a place to give that pain instead of working on yourself because we're living in a time of gluttony. If you break up with somebody, you just get on a dating app and go out with somebody else. And then when you're on that dating app, most of the men that are getting most of the likes is a very small percentage of the overall group. So the ones that aren't getting the likes are even further isolated and told to hate themselves even more. And I think the only thing that can fix this to some extent, and I can't provide a full solution here because it is such a new subject and such a black box, is our government.
Right.
Because we have to stop these algorithms from destroying our society, which they are. I've been the target of these disinformation campaigns. My family doesn't live in Florida anymore because my house got swatted because of the thousands of death threats that I got from people calling me a crisis actor. And it's so pervasive. There are people, even in my own campaign, that I heard were saying that I wasn't at my school during the shooting, even though I was literally interviewing my classmates as the shooting was happening. That is how pervasive this problem is becoming, and it is going to destroy our society if we don't do something about it. And we have to.
I might put.
Yeah. Theo Baker.
I might push back a little bit on the framing of gluttony as the central issue. I frame it possibly more as a problem of immediacy, right? We live in a world where everything is on access 24/7. I came to Stanford as a coder, so I like looking at numbers and stuff. And I was looking through my text message database the other day, just doing some basic data analysis. Yeah. It's fun. I'll send you the code. You can do it.
Yeah.
And it has been more than 580 days since I did not send a single text message in a day. Right. And almost as long since I didn't send more than 10 text messages in a day. Right. And actually, we're talking about these black box algorithms. Well, one of the only things that we do know about the TikTok algorithm that I find to be a really interesting story is that bike dance engineers were told by the Chinese government when their TikTok variant in China was getting too popular and people were spending too much time on it, make your algorithm dumber. Right. Make it, they thought it would make it less addictive, effectively. Right. And so they dumbed down the algorithm. They made it so it's serving you content that's less, content that's less, likely to be your cup of tea. And people started using it more. Like, they made the algorithm dumber, and that meant that people were so desperate for the next dopamine hit, and they were just having to scroll more and more and more to get it. But they weren't leaving. They were just so hooked that they couldn't stop. And because they were getting less content that they liked, they had to keep going more for it. It's sort of like, in drug addiction, right? When, the next hit and the next hit and the next hit doesn't do for you what the first time did. We live in a world where everything is hyper immediate. Yeah. It's interesting. We're talking the panel. I can see the panel title right there, in front of me, and I see our four faces. It's Meet Gen Z, the future of our country. I mean, the truth is, if you look at this stage, right, we don't necessarily look like Gen Z. These are Harvard, Brown, Stanford.
I dropped out of college. But I'm not even in Gen Z, so what am I even doing here? Go on. Yeah. You guys are very fancy.
I also think that in addition to the problems with the algorithms and the tech companies, which I think are super major, I think we also need to think about who is actually posting content and what content is getting boosted and who actually is able to pursue this as a career. And I think what we've seen is also this a huge investment on the part of right-wing billionaires in terms of funding influencers' careers and making that an option for people. I think when you look at a lot of left-wing content creators, they are trying to crowdfund to stay afloat. They're relying solely on their revenue from these social media platforms, which can be very inconsistent in order to do this, whereas you have right-wing people who are getting funded with millions of dollars in order to pursue this as a career. And as a result, you see huge disparities in the number of views and listeners that people get based on that. I think Joe Rogan, and thinking about the right-wing podcast landscape, played a huge role in the 2024 election. There is no left-wing version of Joe Rogan who has been able to accumulate the same massive following.
I'm gonna push back on the Joe Rogan thing because that's like a big left wing. It's a big talking point we're seeing is where is the liberal Joe Rogan? Joe Rogan was liberal, right? Yep. He had Bernie Sanders on his podcast. He endorsed Bernie Sanders in 2016. Liberals left Joe Rogan. Joe Rogan didn't leave liberals. So I am not a fan of Joe Rogan's, but I would say part of how we got here is that liberals, and this is something I feel very passionate about because I used to believe it and I have had a transition, which is liberals refuse to go to spaces that they felt enabled conservatives. So what happened was Bernie went on Joe Rogan and all of his young staffers were like, how dare you? Joe Rogan is this, this, and this. And so the liberals stopped going on Joe Rogan and Joe Rogan said, okay, I don't need you anyway. And that has been, and there have been small, and again, I hate to be the right-wing person on this on this panel, because I'm very lefty, but liberals seeded these spaces, and you can go and talk about this.
Well, look, some days I feel like one of the last liberals standing on Twitter, because I got asked about this when I was actually at a DNC forum. And I think you're right, to some extent, but I also think that you're right to some extent, and I think both those can be true at the same time. I don't think it's because Joe Rogan is getting a ton of right-wing funding that he moved to the right necessarily.
He's been doing this forever.
He has
organically
grew. He doesn't. Frankly, he has fuck you levels of money. He doesn't need, some right-wing billionaires.
But also
to give him money.
and just to explain, Joe Rogan had been famous before. He was the host of Fear Factor.
Right.
He started a podcast way before anyone had podcasts, and he grew by doing hours and hours and hours of programming for years and years and years. So that was organic, as much as any of this is organic.
Yeah, but I also
and
think
it's not just Joe Rogan. I think he's a notable example, but I think there is this huge right-wing media landscape of podcasts.
Right, but Democrats could go on it, I mean, Harris was invited on Rogan, she was invited on Theo Vaughn, like, she should be in all of those spaces. And,
absolutely.
And none of these people, I want to add, are geniuses. You go on Joe Rogan and
he's not Mike Wallace.
Right, he's not Mike Wallace. He's delighted to have you, and he'll ask you about your workout routine. So
and then UFOs and whatever else.
Right, exactly.
My approach to this is, by the way, you're right. We do not look like Gen Z at all. But because I knew that in college and I didn't just want to be surrounded by a bunch of liberals in Cambridge, Massachusetts, I actually went to one of the few places I could find people that vehemently disagreed with me the most, and I joined the shooting club. Right? And I did. As you can imagine.
Don't you have a gun, too?
Huh?
You have a gun, right?
No, I don't.
Oh, okay.
But my family does.
Right.
I did that, and it's not because I was super popular, right? As you can imagine. But when I was in that club, what I realized more than anything, when I'm asked this question about, like, why, like, before the election, I was asked by a journalist, like, why is Gen Z, like, why is there this shift to the right? Is it because it's just a reaction to, like, all these social justice movements and everything? And I struggle with that question because I genuinely believe a lot of Gen Z, and maybe I'm wrong, maybe with y'all's segment of Gen Z it's different, but I do think a lot of Gen Z does support combating gun violence and strengthening gun laws. I do think a lot of them support fighting climate change and combating wealth inequality and other things like that. I think what has happened, though, is that they would rather be around somebody who they don't completely agree with but doesn't judge them, right, than somebody who they do agree with, who they feel like they have to walk on eggshells around constantly because they might say something that's slightly wrong or incorrect, and then they're going to be told, well, how can I improve? And then we say to them, it's not my job to educate you. It is your damn job to educate someone. If you're in politics, because if you don't, somebody else will. Andrew Tate will, right? And when I was in the shooting club and I was talking to them about their views and my views, and we were having a conversation, I said, look, I can respect that you don't agree with me, right? I can respect that you don't want to ban a gun like the AR-15, which some of my friends and colleagues do own AR-15s that were in that club. But I can't respect the fact that, like, you don't want school shootings to continue either, obviously. So what can we agree on? And from that, we were able to talk about, well, we do need more mental health funding for the 2/3 of gun deaths that are suicides, right? We do need better gun safety training for anybody that wants to own a firearm in the United States to know how to properly store and secure and use their firearm. And basic things like that. And from that, because I didn't go and judge them and say you're a terrible person for all these reasons, X, Y, and Z, I was able to form a friendship with them, and now they're some of my closest friends. And with that, that's how we're going to be able to change people's minds, is realizing it is our damn job to educate people. But it's also our damn job not to judge them at the same time, because we're so goddamn condescending to people, we don't even realize it. And we can choose.
I think this is more of a message to Democratic staffers. Which,
Yeah.
right. I mean, who we love and who work very hard, but who sometimes maybe have gotten a little judgy.
Yeah, I mean, Joe Rogan
Right.
could not.
It's not a message to you guys, because you guys are great.
No. I think it's especially a message to our younger segment of Gen Z of realizing, do we want to live in a comfortable delusion where nothing changes? And we create a politics of subtraction and increasingly just excommunicate anybody that isn't perfect. And I'm not saying that we should just accept everyone completely. Right. There are people that should not be in the Democratic Party. You know, white supremacists and neo-Nazis,
Right.
obviously.
Luckily, they don't actually want to be in the Democratic Party.
Exactly. But most people are out there and they're not ideologically moderate, in my opinion. They're not looking for a half-assed solution to school shootings where it's like, I only want a few gun laws. I don't want They want to be told how to think about the world because they're ideologically independent.
Right.
That is different from being
And
moderate.
the other thing is that our government, even on the left, is having a lot of trouble legislating, so nobody has to worry about that. Hannah, I want you to, Emma, I'm going to call you Hannah, but Emma, I want you to talk about climate and where you see climate fitting into it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, as David mentioned, the student climate movement really had a resurgence during the first Donald Trump presidency and was able to build a lot of power and have a lot of mass mobilizations. However, and the Inflation Reduction Act, the largest climate bill in US history, passed, which I think was a really important victory of the student climate movement. I think with the resurgence of Donald Trump, and who is now the president, and having him appoint oil CEOs to head the Department of Energy, trying to strip away environmental regulations, I think is really, really scary for a lot of us, and I think is leaving the movement trying to reevaluate and think about where we go next. And I think the direction things are going in, thinking about state and local action, looking forward to 2026 and 2028, and also building power across movements, because I think what has happened with a lot of social movements on the left is that they fragment by issue. You have a gun violence prevention movement, you have a feminist movement, you have a climate movement, but there's no kind of unified left vision for the country. And I think even seeing this on my college campus, seeing different issue-based groups pop up, and yet there's a lot of people who are going to the same groups but are spread really thin for capacity because they're trying to do so much on all of these different issues. So what the student climate movement is looking forward to is particularly partnering with labor movements, thinking about climate not just as an issue of the environment, but as a policy problem, as a jobs problem. And this is how we're gonna win, is by working kind of to build a broader coalition than we have in the past. I also think that a really important issue is thinking about how we talk to people who don't agree with us or who might not be on our side yet. I think a lot of the models of organizing that people have used in the past in the student climate movement have been mass mobilization. So trying to turn out as many people as we can for protests and having people in the streets. And while that is really effective, I think it's also more important even to be talking to people who don't agree with us in people's schools, workplaces, places of worship, going into those spaces and trying to build majorities, because that is how we are ultimately going to win, is by maybe someone doesn't necessarily think about the environment, but they're worried about the quality of their housing and that their kids are being contaminated by lead paint. Maybe someone is worried about their job. They're thinking about having a union job and having more green jobs. And so this is how we are going to win, is by appealing to things that matter to people, not just thinking about this as an abstract issue, but as an issue that intersects with every aspect of people's lives.
We don't have so much time left. I want you guys to talk, and I want to start with Theo Baker, about where I am increasingly anxious about American democracy. Perhaps that's perhaps that's because I live in spaces where people are incredibly anxious about American democracy. I want you, Theo, you have parents who lived in Russia so they have been very, who are very smart and who have been informed, certainly by the rise of Putin. And I just am curious sort of what your take on where American democracy is and what Gen Z can do to fix it. Go.
Yeah.
Gen Y or Gen Z.
All the gens working together. So You mentioned my parents. I'm a son of, unfortunately. So
That's all right.
I
As
come
if
with,
one
I come with
Nepo
baggage.
baby to another, I feel I can bring it up.
My parents are journalists. They covered the rise of Putin. They wrote the first real book that warned that Putin was a budding dictator, not the darling child of the West that people wanted him to be. That my dad was the first reporter on the ground in rebel-held Afghanistan after 9/11. And so I come to this, I guess, sort of through their perspective, which is that, I'm not a Democrat, I'm not a Republican, I'm a journalist, and there still is a space and a need, by the way, for an independent media.
For sure.
And watching what's happening, I think, in this country is, I think, eerily reminiscent of so many other stories that, people who study history and people who study politics have seen happen on countless occasions. The problem is really in every way, liberalism is afoot in this country, right? And it's not contained to the left or the right, and I think it's actually particularly magnified in our generation because there's a particular dearth of quality, independent information that is both accessed and accessible to the people who are of our generation. So this is a long-winded way of saying, look, I have no idea what's going to happen, and I also think that, the number one thing that I experience with my friends talking about this, as someone who was born in D.C., and so I care about and follow the politics closely, my friends don't care. These are, they're going to be chemical engineers, they're going to be computer scientists, these are people, I'm sure a couple of them will go win a Nobel or do something interesting. And there's a real nihilism, a cultural nihilism about politics, a belief that our system is so fractured and our ability to affect change so diminished that there's no point in paying attention, that the Democrats and the Republicans are, as Josh Hawley would put it, a uniparty.
Right.
And, it's a terrible thing to bring up with 2.5 minutes left in our session, but that also is probably our big struggle, is that we don't know how to talk to each other, we don't know how to take in and process quality information and then distribute it among ourselves. And these two factors, combined with whatever the politicians are going to do about it, do not bode well for a healthy democracy, as you say.
Emma. Sorry.
It's like your kryptonite.
I just can't. I'm a mess. Go. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I think something I've sensed among the general population, but also particularly among organizers, is there's a lot of burnout. I think with Donald Trump's first presidency, a lot of people felt like this was maybe a blip or it was something to kind of be organized against, but that this did not reflect the true nature of our country. And I think with his second presidency, I think a lot of people are feeling the need to tune out and are just feeling generally hopeless. And I think that that is the biggest problem. And I think when you see even what he's done in his first couple weeks of office, the absolute fire hosing of different policies being introduced and people not knowing what information to pay attention to and what to look at and what to do. And so I think trying to see the big picture and remain clear-headed through this. I think also building an alternate vision is so important because when, as David mentioned, the Democratic Party has just been presenting themselves as not the Republicans. But that's not good enough. When we need a vision of what we want for the future, that it doesn't just include what we don't want, but what we do want. And when we see that future, when we are able to imagine it and feel connected to it, that is when we will have the energy to fight for it. So that's what needs to be the work that social movements need to do. That's the work the Democratic Party needs to do, is to build a vision that is compelling and that people want to live in, and then not stop until we get that.
I just want to defend Joe Biden here for a minute because even though
30 seconds left.
Right, I have 30 seconds left because he did pass a lot of really amazing legislation. The fact that he was unable to transmit that to the younger generation is not necessarily, the guy's gotten a pretty hard time during this panel, and I just want to, there was incredible legislation. You'll remember Trump 1.0, it was infrastructure week every week, and he never passed any infrastructure. And Biden did pass this enormous infrastructure spending bill, which has done a lot of good stuff and probably saved the American economy. We're out of time. David, bring us home.
On that note, I agree. I think Joe Biden, he was probably one of the most successful presidents in my lifetime and likely will be the most successful since LBJ. However, it is not enough just to be a commander-in-chief.
Right.
You have got to be a communicator-in-chief. And unfortunately, as great as all the things that we accomplished on climate and gun violence and other things were, people still saw their rents go up 30 or 40% in many parts of this country. And if we don't provide a better economic vision for this country that also includes those values of social justice at the same time and do both of those, we are not going to be able to win as a party. And we have to be able to communicate what we are actually doing for people, and not just doing it on MSNBC or CNN, but doing it on the podcast, doing it on social media. And with that, I think to answer this question about the future, if there's anything that I've learned from studying history, it's that great generations aren't born. They're made in the crucible of awful circumstances, right? And the leaders arise out of those moments. And I have to believe in those millions of young people, maybe this is just like hopelessly optimistic of me, but I have to believe in those millions of young people that have marched with us, that have organized across the country in the largest student protests in American history, that already have accomplished a great amount. Gun violence under President Biden's administration went down by double digits. That's not anywhere near enough, obviously. It still doesn't address the fact that there was a drive-by shooting that happened 2 blocks away from my house 6 months ago in D.C., but we are making progress, right? And what I'm trying to do now is bring that generation that marched with us, that was working to change the government and still hasn't gotten all the changes that we want, to bring us into government so that we can be the changes that we wanted to see but didn't have nearly enough of in the beginning. And that's what I'm trying to do.
Thank you.